afternoon. Is everyone good? Well fed? Okay. So, I don't have slides. I'll refer to my lecture notes here. But I'll give you a brief of what I'll cover in this 1 hour session. And I had certain plans to discuss the Disartho reading, which of course has been circulated, and I'm assuming that most of you have browsed, if not very minutely read it. But I improvised based on the discussions we were having since yesterday, and I think instead of plunging into Disartho, I'll start with something else. I'll get into Disartho in the middle, and then I'll talk about a little bit about digital stuff, so that could act as a segue or transition into what we discuss in terms of digitality over the course of the next sessions. So, I just wanted to invoke this book called, I'll use, so this is a book by Ian Hacking. He's a historian and philosopher of science, and he talks about people who traveled without a reason and they forget everything about how they traveled. So this was a very curious case in late 19th century France and Germany, to be precise, and I'll come to this in a moment why I'm invoking this. So this book came out in 1998, and around 1880s and 1890s in France in particular, and also in Germany, there was this strange case of men. Typically these were men, not women, and I'll come to the gendered aspect in a moment. Usually again working class soldiers or laborers, so it's very classed and it's very gendered. They were found wandering inexplicably across both countryside and the city. And this book is actually about a very famous case study about this guy called Albert Dadas, who was found 30 years later in the US. So he was a lightman. 19th century France used to go about in the streets on his bicycle lighting street lamps. So one fine morning he was missing. People couldn't find him. So he was only identified almost 30 years later. So I might miss the details, but I mean, long story short, that's how it runs. So this guy was discovered in the US, and when he was discovered, he almost didn't remember anything about how he traveled, and he forgot about his light man role in France and all of that. So, and he immediately became a very interesting case study for medical practitioners. He was brought back to France. Medical practitioners used him as a very interesting case study, and they started studying him. And they figured out that he apparently set out on foot, crossing borders and returning only when he collapsed from exhaustion or was detained by the police. But again, long story short, he didn't remember anything about how he went to the US. But for Hacking, this diagnosis reveals something profound about the historicity of organization of space. So that's the nodal connection I'm trying to bring. And Hacking uses this concept of what he calls So this case study became a feud between French and the German doctors, and like they came up with new terminologies, and they classified a quote-unquote disease, what is otherwise known as dromomania or fugue. Dromomania, I think, with respect to the Athens connection that we were discussing, it comes from a Greek word. Dromo means like a passage. So it's a fear of passage, roughly translates very literally as fear of passage. And fugue, people who are into music would know what fugue is. Anyone has any idea what is a fugue?
Is it back condition of fugitive?
etymologically, yes, but what is a like fugue in musical terms? It's a musical term, but different notes come together, so it's a different element that comes together to form a notation or whatever. But anyway, so the whole, and some doctors apparently classified it as hysteria. And you have to, in 19th century Europe, you have to also take into account the gendered connection, because hysteria was initially, even if you come across Freud's writing, it was a feminine thing. Like men almost never got hysteria. It's only female subjects who were diagnosed to be afflicted with hysteria. So some doctors called it hysteria, others called it dromomania, others called it fugue, and all of that. So there were like whole debate about classifying the disease, and they apparently medicalized mobility. So that's our central connection. So, and Ian Hacking invokes the concept of the second point here, ecological niche. So the question Ian Hacking is asking here is, why is fugue or dromomania, the disease in particular, diagnosed as a disease in 1890s and 1880s in France and Germany, but not in other places? Like this was not, fugue or dromomania was not a disease in, let's say, US or Japan, for example. So it was a disease very specific to France and Germany in 1880s and 1890s. And why is this not a disease in other times, for example? So by the 1930s, no doctor in Germany or France would identify a itinerant patient to be afflicted by fugue or dromomania. So is the question clear? So this is Ian Hacking's question. He's asking, why is this a disease only in France and Germany, only in particular time? So any hunch, like why do you think that be the case? Or any other such classifications, medical classifications or otherwise, that you think is a function of space and time?
The whole colonial delusion with the Criminal Tribes Act and the Thuggy Act, the 1830s, 50s, 60s in India.
But in India, but this is France and Germany, to be precise. So you are talking about like the resonance. Okay, but any...
Could it be that the structures, the infrastructure is so repetitive that one does not know where to locate themselves? So they started from and therefore getting lost.
Not so literal, but you are close in the sense that there's a question of alienation, certainly in terms of the spatial organization. There's a psychological effect, of course, and in terms of like urban spatial organization, what do you think was going on in France 1880s, 1890s in terms of urban restructuring? So what was happening in France? Yes.
I shouldn't, but I know.
Yes.
Paris has been completely restructured. Urbanization.
The Haussmannian revolution and all of that. So can anyone quickly recap? So do you know what was happening around that time? What was the Parisian restructure all about? So can you say a couple of lines maybe for the students?
Me?
Yes, please.
Well, this is coming out of the Third Republic, okay? And what happened was Napoleon III comes to power by like hijacking the instruments of Republican politics, and it becomes again an empire. Okay, that's and what he does is that he appoints the prefect of Paris, Baron Haussmann, to restructure the city by demolishing vast parts of it. And that means that they are trying to eliminate opportunities for rebellion. So old neighborhoods must be like cracked open, literally. They are trying to make room for bourgeois consumption. That means you need to have new building types, new institutions, and just investment in infrastructure. So this was very much a partnership between the bourgeoisie and the state, because the state is the only one who can change land use laws. Okay? So the project of the state and the bourgeoisie comes together in an utter refashioning of Paris. Paris between 1860s and 1880s became unrecognizable, okay, because vast neo-Baroque vistas were drawn through the city, destroying old neighborhoods. And that means it's redistribution of the fabric, also a redistribution of the population. The poor no longer had a space in the city, so they were literally thrown out to the termes banlieue, the outskirts.
These were beggars, vagrants, prostitutes,
right,
so on and so forth. And in terms of grid, I'm trying to map this question onto two central nodes that we have discussed so far. One is the question of mapping, and other one is grid. And Paris also had a very interesting grid structure. I'm sure that you know it more than I do, but Parisian grid was not like a east-west kind of a crisscross grid, but it's more like all the central roads met into. So it's a very different imagination of grid. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is the question of mapping and how, in terms of urban restructuring of space, there are certain kind of a demographic that was unwanted, and the question of social degeneracy that was very prevalent at that point of time in Paris, that produces a kind of alienation effect, and which is why Ian Hacking invokes the notion of ecological niche, and he says that it is because of the ecological niche that is a function of space and time. So now, why begin a discussion on Michel Desartaux's Walking in the City with Ian Hacking? Because I think that resonance I'm trying to draw your attention to is that how movement becomes legible or illegible within certain spatial arrangements and arrangements of certain coordinates of power, and how certain forms of mobility are authorized while others are pathologized, invisible, or medicalized. So I'm trying to get into that, because if you have checked, the title of the section is like being in the city. So we are trying to for the last two lectures yesterday actually we were talking about city from the designing perspective, like how people in positions of power and authority design the city, and conversely what I'm trying to bring to your attention is the fact that how people especially if you have consulted the Desartaux reading, like how does the city look from below. So what is the starting, if anyone remembers, what is the starting passage in the Desartaux reading?
Starts by the vantage point is about
The Manhattan thing, if you remember.
yes,
so what
Wall
is
Street, then the depression of Midtown, Greenwich, then skyscrapers in Midtown, then goes to Central Park, acting in Central Park, and then to Harlem.
Correct. So what does it happen? In other words, what does it happen when you look at the city atop from the Manhattan? So this is the question he is trying to ask. And from that height, the city seems to stretch out as a perfectly coherent grid, a system of straight lines, the kind of illustrations that we have had seen so far. It's a pure visual or optical field, which is very coherent and very symmetric in that sense. So this is what Desartaux calls the voyeur God perspective. So that's an expression that he uses. So the observer at this height feels a sense of mastery, the power. So these are the questions that we were already discussing. So this should be familiar to you by now. And the power to read the city as if it were a map. So the whole imagination of the city as a coherent map, or better still, a code. So the point I'm trying to make here is, like, there are certain elements, certain demographic elements that do not fit into this kind of a imagination. For example, the Fugners or the Dromomaniacs in 1880s, 1890s France. So these are like just one example of a certain kind of itinerant subjects that wouldn't otherwise fit into this gridded or coherent or coded imagination of the city. So this elevated view is an illusion. I think we all, like the whole discussion on abstraction that we had yesterday, I think we are all, you will all agree with me so far that it's an abstraction or an illusion. It's a fantasy of control, and the kind of vision urban planners, bureaucrats and cartographers cultivate to towards certain bureaucratic goals. So it is the strategic vision of power, the city as something that can be known, mapped and governed. So the whole question of, I think one of you brought, I think Rick invoked Foucault in the discussion session during the last lecture, so I'll try to address that in a moment. So now decide to shift the focus from skyscraper to the street, and like what is the difference? So he talks about strategy and tactics, if you remember, and we'll try to draw up like what the differences are. But then down below, he says that it's a very different view of the city. The city looks different. It's noisy, crowded, embodied. Pedestrians move unpredictably, of course, improvising routes, cutting corners, hesitating at intersections. And toward the end of the lecture, I'll talk about the digital stuff, and I'll talk about something that I studied, especially with bicyclists in Calcutta, and I'll talk about how they use digital network, especially with reference to these intersections, hesitation at intersections and so on. And he writes, I quote, the ordinary practitioners of the city live down below the thresholds at which visibility begins. So in other words, I'm trying to draw your attention to the question of optics, visibility, and being in the city. The whole business of optics is very important here. So the city is not a map. So I think the imagination of the city as a map and imagination of the city from below, which is not necessarily in terms of a codified vision, but a lived environment or a lived experience, which is which Sartre calls, which is a field of practice. So the contrast between static vision from above and the tactical expressions from below becomes then the point of contrast. So we'll come to that, but can anyone strategy and tactics? So what are the principal differences between the two?
Tactic is intuition, how we maneuver the system. Tactic includes shortcuts.
And conversely, strategy would then be collective?
Collective institution.
Procedure is included in strategy.
Procedural as opposed to?
Logical progression. Yes.
Let's go to rationality. And conversely?
Power in strategy.
Sorry?
There is a sense of power in strategically controlling institutions.
Power as opposed to? So what are the converse characteristic would be?
Tactics. Random.
I don't think so. And that's the whole point. It's not random.
So tactic could be unplanned,
Yes.
while strategies are mostly planned with a blueprint.
Okay. Yes. But unplanned, but not necessarily random.
Definitely not.
Yes. And
It's part of a moment to get to be tactical attention. And it's part of the moment. It's spontaneous.
yes.
Sort of tactics are sort of like strategies are long-term things.
Okay.
Tactic is more lived, more embodied.
Yes, that's the yes. and lived as opposed to
Live is opposed to envision.
or mapped. Let's
Yeah.
mapped. I think we are still missing one fundamental point here. Any idea once you see this, what are we missing? Try to relate it with the previous lectures. What has this got to do with space? What has this got to do with abstraction?
Coherent as opposed to contingent.
Agreed, your point is well taken, but that is still not like a.
Strategy on certain knowledge, certain type of expertise. That is what you are looking for.
Yes, but then can you zero in on, in terms of what we discussed so far, in terms of abstraction, in terms of space, in terms of.
Strategy would the strategy would lead to certain abstractions, but may have a more material impact on the target population demography or the target space.
You are close. In other words, this is spatial. So when you map something, it's a spatial vision that you have. You reorient space as opposed to tactic, which is temporal. Correct. You do not have to necessarily agree with me, but this is my takeaway from the Desartu reading. I think this is one one of the fundamental distinctions he makes between strategy and tactics. Is one is spatial vision, coherence, and so on and so forth, as opposed to being tactical involves like temporal improvisation. So I think the improvisation question is also important. So strategies define and discipline the urban order. Think of again, like in terms of the discussions we have had so far, create zoning regulations, the kind of repetitive elements in the building, or surveillance infrastructures, and so on and so forth. Tactics, by contrast, are how ordinary people make certain things like appear, or they do certain things. I'll give you examples, like illustrations from my own work, and how they poach a space. So poach is also like an expression that Desartu uses, and how they navigate systems not of their own making. So this is also important. So these are people navigating the system they have not made for themselves. So in other words, these are spatially designed by people who assume power, and then being tactical involves navigating those spatial imageries that have not been necessarily designed by people who are navigating it. So for Desartu then, walking is quintessentially a tactic. So are you with me so far? Like this thing is clear, right? This is, so now the move that Desartu makes is he posits walking as a tactical practice. So why do you think he would do that? So every pedestrian act, every deviation, every shortcut, every pause, he says reconfigures the spatial order of the city. But how, in terms of this arrangement, in terms of this contrast, why do you think would walking be tactical?
You see, spatial and temporal walking is a tenuous temporal activity, and does not cover a lot of space within, but takes a lot of time. So it's more engaging with a small amount of space, but temporarily the effect lasts longer, and it's an engaging exercise while it's being practiced.
So by your logic, then driving would not be tactical because driving is faster.
Driving may be aided more by a machine. I mean, I'm only thinking on the lines now, and therefore I know it's temporarily sped up and covering a lot of space, but then it's aided by some sort of technology. So one might not be as immersed in a small or a large amount of space, that is happening in walking and that is happening in driving. So there would be a significant difference of spatial immersion and the embodied experience will definitely be different.
I think embodiment is the question here. That's the point that Descartes is trying to get at when he writes the act, and I quote, the act of walking is to the urban system what the speech act is to language. So this is a quotation that so what exactly is the speech act? And where does this analogy come from? Why does he say that walking is to the city what speech act is to language? What exactly is the speech act?
There are different versions of the same language, as in the colloquial language, speech that emerges in the same language. So is it similar to that?
Are you asking? Okay. I'll answer that later. Yes.
I'm taking a guess here. It might be related to discourse, to the whole structured understanding of discourse.
Can you elaborate a little bit in the sense?
Gulabad talks about in the urban, the semiology of the urban, how there is a certain language of the city, a vernacular language of the city. So maybe walking, maybe I'm taking a wild guess here, might be as an act of walking, might be related to the act of speaking the language of the city. So it could be connected to those.
I think you are missing the analogy question here. He is saying walking is to the city what speech act is to language. He is not equating walking with a language. So walking is not language. I think you are missing out the analogy point here. There's an analogy. So you have to first understand what is speech act to language, and then you have to think about the analogy.
I think, sir, that the speech is dictating the speed and all the process of walking. So here, what is acts?
So, but what is a speech act? So we are trying to get to the fundamentals. What exactly is a speech act?
I can't explain very critically, but what I've read is like, for example, in marriages when people say like you are married, and the way we see in churches, the act of marriage doesn't take place as such, but it's the speech that legitimizes the
Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is like speech act is Stanley Fish propounded certain aspects of speech act. If I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong. But this thing specific was specific as that.
So anyway, to put very grossly or simply, like speech acts are certain actions of speech that bring certain things into existence. For example, in Sunanda's example, it's a marriage. Like there's no procedural way of marrying. Only like the priest declares the man and the woman to be legally wed. So the moment you utter it, they are wed. They are wedded, right? So, and why would you think this? Like, what's the analogy with walking then?
The analogy with walking, I think here, because I'll give you an example of Google Maps and
Google Maps.
Google Maps,
Okay.
like just to contextualize what you said. If I go back to the context of tactic and strategy and why tactic and what is related, so I think, for example, maps, let's say, legitimizes or let's say visibilizes certain area. And for example, Google Maps show me from here to there you should take this path. So me as an individual, if I'm supposed to follow the path that Google Maps shows me, but there might be an alternative path that the map might not show to its users. So if I take that route to reach the same destination, I'm being tactful here and I'm kind of like giving life to the path that has not been covered or that has not been taken up by.
What has that got to do with speech act? How is this analogous to speech act? That is the tactical element. I think we are all getting at that. But then why do you think Descartes is comparing it with a speech act? So you understand the fundamentals. What is a speech act we all discuss now. Then why is walking a speech act analogously to a speech act?
I believe that language by itself is like a very generalized concept, but this speech act it imparts a dynamism to the concept of language. And similarly, city by itself is a like generalized concept. The city exists, but the act of walking it imparts dynamism to the concept of a city. So that's, I think, is sort of my understanding.
Okay. Any other guesses? Any other?
It legitimizes the space. I mean, in the sense that if I'm walking or if a group of people walk along that particular place, or walk along that particular road, I mean, that sort of makes the road more popular and maybe, just thinking along it, along a utilitarian way, maybe more shops are going to pop up. So it's like that. So maybe the just simple act of walking sort of, makes the makes the road or the street more visible. That way.
But that would then be strategic, not necessarily tactical. By your logic, that would be more strategic, right? Because it involves planning. It involves like a futurist vision.
It categorizes the road as a road, let's say. Like if she takes a walk along this road and then following her, if 5 or 10 people more say, okay, this is the road, then we are also going to take this road. So this road comes into existence as a road, which might not have existed, let's say, some days or some years, sometime.
Okay, but can you think anything in terms of like, what has this got to do with governance or governmentality? If there are, I figured out some Foucauldian enthusiasts here. So what has this got to do with governmentality? Because also remember, like, language is governed by rules. So you are understanding what I am saying precisely because we are on the same boat and we are all have come to a consensus, whatever words, whatever it means, we are unanimously agreeing to it, right? Which is otherwise arbitrary.
So, does it have anything, let's say I utter words, I do actions that the government takes in control of those words and actions to control me. So my actions lead me to be in control of government.
But the analogy with walking is still not clear. So speech acts are governed by rules, and then what has analogously got to do
So
with?
basically, like as we have seen in the previous lectures, the concept of grid and streets is fundamental to city formation. So because like walking is understood to be on the streets or on the roads, so you see that walking by itself is governed by the rules.
Correct. So that's the point I'm trying to. So, but you still have the possibility of being tactical or subverting the rules that you think you are governed by. So that's the analogy with speech. Is that fine? Like, are any doubts? Any clarifications? So I think we have covered the distinction here. So this is, I think, the heart of Desartu's point in my understanding, the city, and he talks about the city as a rhetoric or a city as a text. So this is also one important point he talks about, which is a text that is continuously written and rewritten by its users, by which he means especially pedestrians and walkers. And urban planners might inscribe the city through, as we have seen, maps, grids, blueprints, master plans. But everyday walkers inscribe it through movement, habit, and improvisation. So that's the whole analogy with Speech Act. And these inscriptions are transient. And if you remember the temporality question here, and he says that walking gives the city a life, otherwise very coherently governed by grids and maps. So he writes, walking affirms, suspects, tries out, transgresses, respects, etc. The trajectories it speaks. So I think that this is the analogy I'm trying to get at. So by walking, you are actually speaking the city. That is his point. This is Desartu, not necessarily. This is not me speaking. This is Desartu's point. So the city is not just designed, as opposed to as we have seen in the master plans. So this is not just designed; it is also performed and lived. The way he talks about, especially the hesitations at the intersections example, and space is not a fixed entity, and this is performed, this is enlinked. So the relation now to Foucault, which I again improvised from the discussion that we had last session, what is is there any resonance with Foucault's understanding of power, diffusion of power, biopolitics here with the subversive nature of walking that this article is talking about? Yes. Can we think of the question of agency? People who are working with space, if you find any resonance with Lefebvre's work, Poetics of Space? No? So is there a question of scale involved here? Anyone read Lefebvre's
So I'm
Poetics of
currently
Space?
reading it, so I'm currently reading Lefebvre for one of my papers. So I know there's basic concept of rhythm analysis and the production of space. How space is a contested construct, which is I'm just going through it, so I can't.
Any resonance so far?
Regarding poetics of space.
Yes, to resonance with what Desartu is saying in terms of walking.
Well, I think that like I said, walking is a dynamic activity. It
But in terms of scale.
so there's a scale.
Yes. So we're discussing scale here. This is a more macro thing, whereas Desartu is talking about like a very micro thing in terms of diffusion of power and subversion. Here, I think this is like one further reading that you might consult here, how Lefebvre showed that space is socially produced, and in terms of the yes.
Production of space.
Poetics of space is special.
Special.
Sorry. Yes, so I think the question of scale being invoked here, Lefebvre talks about like a more macro aspect of it, macro structures of spatial production, and he invokes cooking, reading, talking, walking, etc. But Desartu is talking about more micro aspect here, like everyday agency and everyday politics, the small and the flitting ways individuals inhabit the city. So that's one resonance here. And tactics as everyday resistance here. Tactics then are subtle forms of resistance. So this is, I think, the key argument that Desartu is making. So it's not revolutionary in that sense, and it's by nature very inventive and imaginative. So the Desartu discussion, I'll stop here. So these are the two principal points that I wanted to make. Is there any questions about the Desartu thing before I go and share a little bit of my own thing with bicyclists in Calcutta, and I'll talk about how they repurpose the space using digital networks in the wake of the pandemic. So is there any clarifications regarding the Desartu reading? No. Okay. So I'll So I'll be happy to share the paper with you if you are interested, but I'll briefly talk about this. So we have not studied pedestrians as such, but we have studied bicyclists. So I'll quickly describe what we did and what has this got to do with the kind of stuff that Desartu is talking about. So we studied bicyclists in Kolkata, and we used a case study how bicyclists used the fitness app Strava. I'm sure that many of you use it. Anyone familiar with the app? So it's a health and fitness app. Like it's very popular with youngsters especially. So at a time when movement was prohibited, especially after the pandemic, and if you recall, especially unlike many other parts of the world, health activities were not considered essential activities. Like for example, in Belgium and France, for example, like health and fitness activities were outside of the COVID norms, and people could step out, walk into the parks and everything. But in India, especially, all forms of mobility were disrupted. So the gyms were closed, and also you couldn't walk actually. You couldn't step out into the park, unlike in many other parts of the world. So people actually used Strava, and I'll tell you why this is an interesting case study, because they used the very same technology that the government used actually with the health, what are those monitoring apps? The Arogya Setu. So there was a special name for it. What was it called? No, there's a name of the app, but it has a generic name. That's a particular name. But what are all those apps otherwise generically called that diagnosed COVID-related case in your proximity? Whatever, it's a health app. Let's call it health app for the moment. But it had a generic name. So they used the very same technology actually in a very subversive way, and we studied people who were using Strava actually to connect with other cyclists. So these were people who were not otherwise within the network. They formed networks during COVID using Strava. So they used Strava in the same way otherwise use let's say WhatsApp or Facebook. So they used it as a network, and they cycled in parts of Kolkata that were otherwise not deemed as cycle-friendly zone. For example, those who are familiar with the Kolkata map, Rajarhat New Town area, for example, Bisho Bangla Gate, which is a business district, let's say. So you cannot, even in normal times, bicycling is prohibited. So we studied how people cycled at odd hours, 5 a.m. in the morning, to evade police scrutiny, 5 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning. And we studied how people networked amongst themselves using the app. So if any one of you who have used the Arogya Setu app, you could actually, it just works as an instant messaging app. So you could just, instead of WhatsApp where you know the other people around, have you ever used a hospitality app or something? Like for example, I use one which is called Couchsurfing. So if you pull the chat function, the instant messaging app of Couchsurfing, you will get to see in my proximity how many Couchsurfers are there. So these are all random networks. Like you don't know the other Couchsurfer, but I would know like 30 kilometers in my radius, is there a Couchsurfer around? So that app will show. So exactly Arogya Setu did so. Is there a COVID inflicted person in a 10 kilometers radius? So that's what they update. So that's what they use Strava for. So in other words, long story short, like sorry about the self-promotion, I didn't want to promote my article, but long story short, the point I'm trying to make is they kind of subverted the system. So these are apps basically meant for health and fitness things, but they used it for something else rather than what it was intended for. So these were people who kind of networked using Strava. They were cycling in spaces that were designated non-cycling zones, and they were doing it at a time when stepping out of your home was prohibited. So we did ethnography with a bunch of people, and we asked them about their networking practices, what they did, how they did, and of course we also studied the question of intermediality, in the sense that many of those networks stayed beyond the Strava group, and people made friends, people formed groups and networks that extended beyond Strava. People started forming WhatsApp groups and so on and so forth. So this, in my opinion, would an example of like this is not exactly walking in like the literal sense of the term, but the point I'm trying to make is this is a very tactical use of certain digital applications. Strava in this case, which kind of they turned the table back and they started using it in inventive, tactical ways, which explains why we call it jugaad. So this is a very inventive use in resource-strapped environment. So these were also like people were very lower middle class people who could barely afford a bicycle. So these are not like very well-off people who kind of use the app the way they did. So I think I'll stop here. If you have any questions, anything about the risotto reading or this thing.
So why are you calling so cycling as jugaad?
No, because this is inventive use of. So
Same app.
yes.
So the study was done when COVID protocol was active, right?
When the lockdown was being lifted in a phased manner, so we have done the field work in a phased manner during different times over an elongated period. So many of them actually borrowed the bicycles, like some people, because bicycle shops were closed. So even if people could afford a bicycle, the shops were closed. So they like either refurbished old bicycles, they borrowed a bicycle from a friend. So there were a lot of these cases, like people they couldn't like go out and buy a bicycle right away. That was not possible. Yes. Any other questions?
So was there any further intentional response from the state because if you know about it, then obviously the state knows about it. So
Can't speak on camera. The state thing will follow after a while.
what happened to Strava after the COVID?
No, it's very popular app. It's a popular health app.
But this thing, any other subversive
No, because
activity does not happen?
no, because the gyms have opened. So that is the whole temporal logic. So that's what we began with. So this is the strategy thing is spatial, whereas the tactical thing is temporal. So that's the whole. Now you connect the whole thing. So that's the whole reason I began the discussion with the unhacking. In as much as fugue or dromomania was a disease diagnosed in a particular time and place, Strava was being used in a particular time and place for that reason only for a very short duration. That's it. It's over now. No one would use Strava like this. Strava is an health app and people use it. What it is intended for.
First of all, I am not really aware with this topic. So I am asking out of curiosity regarding this restructuring of Paris. So when we restructure spatio-geographical contours of the city, so there is a limit, certain limit of architectural violence embedded in that restructuring of that city. So is there any possibility of epistemic violence?
Difficult question. I can't answer frankly speaking.
Suppose, as Professor told, with the restructuring of city, the segregation of the poor, marginal people, so it kind of invalidates their understanding of the
A certain
space,
demographic, yes.
their experiences, their knowledge system. Architecture is related architectural violence.
I think Shati will answer it in the next. So she's an architect. She's a
I'm
trained
just asking
architect.
out of curiosity.
No, but like her lectures will contain what you are wanting to know. But
How about this? I'll throw in some slides of Paris tomorrow, okay? So we can talk about Paris. Because Paris is not a great, okay? It's a neo-Baroque plan. Okay? So that has a very different structure, and it is a significant difference in terms of spatio-temporal logic. I think the question you're asking is that architectural violence, yes, it is accompanied by some not just epistemic, but it is political violence. And this was very much about the suppression of the working class. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. Okay? Because the city was being refashioned to make room for the bourgeoisie, unfettered. Okay? So streets were made, were at the time it's still horses and wagons. It's still not cars, but they were meant to move faster. So it was very unsettling. All the the paintings we can think of the Impressionists doing is an effect of that, them trying to register the spatial temporal sort of the scattering of Paris. But one thing that when you're talking about the view and all of that, one thing that was still valorized, though it was a resistant act, was flânerie. So that was not considered a disease, okay, because it was practiced by the elite of elites, poets, philosophers, and so on and so forth, as a resistant act, because the state wanted, transport to move fast. The biggest sport was to take a turtle for a walk, right? So the thing is that these were kind of like exemplary resistant act, which of course the working class could not participate.
Of course,
right?
yes.
So that was not pathologized. This is something that's important to recognize.
So that is where the question of ecological niche comes in. So there's a distinction between then good mobility and bad mobility.
Right.
So only certain types of mobility, like they meet the statist scrutiny, so to say.
Yeah, we all know that if the rich move, then it's just fine. If the poor move, it ain't fine. Okay, it's very simple. I mean, that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
So when the rich move, we call it cosmopolitanism, and when the poor move, we just call them vagabonds. Okay, so that's what it is. Vagabonds or vagrants.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. Maybe I missed it, but did you explain what is ecological niche?
Niche in the sense that it's a function of space and time. So fugodromomania, for example, was not a disease in the 1880s and 90s elsewhere, except for France and Germany, and also in another time. So by 1930s, for example, there were no diagnosed case of fugodromomania. So it was only persistent or endemic in a particular place in a particular time. So, I mean, it's a metaphorical play of the word, ecological in the sense that he says the ecology has got to do with the diagnosis. That is his argument. Do not take it literally. It's a metaphorical play of the word. So it's a niche, he argues, which is a function of the ecology.
So we differentiated between tactic and strategy, and we all agreed how walking is considered in the literature considered as a tactic, because we all said that walking can capture the experiences, the embodiments. So I'm just curious, the experience can be different to different group of people. I can have a experience,
Different
you
views.
can have a different experience depending on the position it is where we are coming. I'm just curious about this. So will the experience or the embodiment be we are walking on the same street, following the same tactic, but the experience can be different.
Of course.
Different people.
So that's why I think we put it here. The first point was collective versus individual. So that was the first set of distinction that we made. So it's a very individualized experience. So it doesn't have to be necessarily subversive. That is one among the many criteria, but it's primarily it's also the individual versus collective.
Strategy and tactic, the concepts that we covered, seemingly very different from each other, but then I think it's just an observation. I was just thinking while I was reading the text. Google Maps kind of subverts the whole thing, right? I mean, it brings both of these two together, because a person who is using the app, they can also kind of update. If say a road is blocked, that person will be able to update that this road is blocked. So maybe the other person who's seeing that might take some other road, right? So that is kind of
bringing strategy and tactic together. So it's not necessarily two very starkly different things.
No, I think that is also not the point Desartu is making, and that was also not our intent. I think at one point we are also acknowledging the fact that tactic emerges from strategy. So I mean, you do not have, let's say, vagrants or vagabonds unless you have a certain reorganization of, like a special reorganization. So it's like the other face of the coin. So it's not starkly different as you say, but I think one emerges from the other. So you are being tactical because you have a certain kind of special organizations, right? So, like again, like the reason that I invoked hacking right at the beginning is you cannot have working class men fleeing their domicile, completely forgotten about how they traveled, unless you are the Haussmannian revolution.